My mom played favorites my whole life, then nearly killed my son just to prove a point. She ignored me as a child, dismissed me as a mother, and laughed when I begged her to take my son's allergies seriously. Then she fed him something she knew would send him to the hospital because she thought I was overreacting. Now she's in a mental health facility, and for the first time ever I'm finally free. I always knew my mother loved my younger sister more. Even as a kid, I could feel it. I don't think she ever meant to be cruel, but the way she treated us made it clear. Jane was the favorite, and I was the afterthought. My mother, Sylvia, had been through a lot. My father died unexpectedly when I was 5, leaving her to raise me and my 2-year-old sister alone. People excused her coldness by saying she's just grieving. Raising 2 kids on her own is hard. But grief doesn't last forever, and neither does sympathy. I was a wild kid, always running outside, playing in the dirt, laughing at strangers just to see if they'd smile back. But I never got that same warmth from my own mother. She was always too tired, too angry, too busy to notice me. Meanwhile, Jane was the perfect little angel, quiet, obedient, soft-spoken. She clung to Mom's leg like a shadow, and Mom loved it. I used to try so hard to make her happy. I'd set the table without being asked, help Jane with her toys, even clean up before she got home. Once when I was 8, I made her a card with paper flowers glued on the front. It was messy and the glue smeared my handwriting, but I was proud of it. She barely looked at it before setting it aside. Jane, on the other hand, drew a single stick figure family with wobbly letters spelling I love MOM, and it got pinned to the fridge for months. That was the moment I stopped trying. Since Dad was gone, I stepped into a role I never asked for. Mom worked long hours, and since Jane was too young to take care of herself, that responsibility fell on me. At 10 years old, I was already cooking simple meals, packing lunches, and helping with homework. If Jane cried at night, I'd be the one getting out of bed to calm her down. If she got sick, I'd be the one holding her hand while Mom snapped at me for not doing more. By the time I turned 13, I had a part-time job, handled most of the chores, and still took care of Jane. But nothing I did was ever good enough. If the laundry wasn't folded perfectly, she'd redo it in front of me, shaking her head like I was useless. If dinner wasn't exactly how she liked it, she'd complain but still eat every bite. At some point, I gave up trying to win her approval. I stopped talking to her unless necessary. The house became a battlefield where the only way to survive was to keep my head down. Jane, though? She didn't just survive, she thrived. She was growing into Mom's perfect little clone, quiet and agreeable. She'd sit with Mom at the kitchen table, whispering secrets and giggling at inside jokes I wasn't part of. And I hated it. It wasn't Jane's fault, but I resented her anyway. I started pulling away, shutting her out, ignoring her attempts to be close to me. She didn't deserve my anger, but it was easier to be mad at her than to admit the truth. I just wanted to be loved the way she was. If there was any doubt about where I stood, my high school graduation erased it. I wasn't expecting a big celebration. Jane's middle school ceremony had been a full event, but I knew better than to hope for the same. Still, I thought Mom would at least show up. She didn't. Jane had a cold that day. Just a cold. Not the flu, not pneumonia, just a runny nose and a slight fever. And that was enough for Mom to stay home. I sat in the auditorium, looking out at the crowd of proud parents, knowing mine wasn't there. I walked across that stage alone. That night, I packed my bags for college earlier than I needed to. I wanted out. I needed out. If she didn't care about me, I wasn't going to waste my life caring about her either. I left for college the moment I could. I didn't look back, didn't give my mother a long goodbye, didn't even try to stay in touch. There was nothing left for me in that house, no warmth, no love, just memories of a childhood spent trying to earn something that was never mine to begin with. I threw myself into my new life, determined to finally be free, and for a while it worked. I didn't call home, and my mother didn't call me. Jane sent the occasional text, but our conversations were short, just enough to remind me that she existed and that I existed to her, but nothing more. It wasn't enough to make me miss home. I thought I was done with that part of my life. Then I met Daniel. He was everything I thought I wanted: older, charming, someone who looked at me like I was worth something. I was young and desperate to feel wanted, and he gave me that. We got married quickly, too quickly, but I ignored the warnings, convinced myself I was finally building the family I never had. When I got pregnant, I felt like I was finally getting my fresh start, a life where I would be the mother I never had, where my child would never feel like I did. I was determined to give Jaden all the love I had never known. Reality hit fast. Daniel wasn't who I thought he was. The charm wore off, and underneath it was someone who needed control, who needed power, who needed me to be smaller. The words turned cruel first, little jabs about how I wasn't good enough, about how I should be grateful to him, about how no one else would put up with me. Then came the yelling. Then came the days where I didn't even recognize the man I had married. I told myself I could handle it, that I had survived worse, that I could make it work. But then one night, when Jaden was barely 2, Daniel threw a plate against the wall so hard that it shattered across the floor, shards flying inches from where my son was playing. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I filed for divorce the next day. Daniel fought me on it, tried to convince me I was overreacting, but I didn't listen. I took Jaden and left, with nowhere to go but back to the town I had spent my whole life trying to escape. I didn't tell my mother I was coming back. I rented a small apartment, found a job in marketing that let me work from home so I could be there for Jaden, and started over again. I wanted nothing to do with my past. Nothing to do with the family that had let me go so easily, but Jane found out somehow. She called, said she wanted to see me, wanted to meet Jaden. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When she showed up, she wasn't alone. My mother was with her, standing in my doorway like we hadn't spent years pretending each other didn't exist. I should have shut the door, should have sent them both away, but Jaden ran up to Jane instantly, excited to see someone new, and I couldn't bring myself to ruin that moment for him. So I let them in. I let them sit on my couch. I let my mother act like she had never been absent. She smiled at Jaden, asked him questions, played with him like she had always been there. It was strange, unsettling, and I hated how easily she fell into the role of doting grandmother when she had never been a mother to me. I wanted to ask her why she had never tried to reach out before now, why she had let me disappear without a second thought. When Jaden finally fell asleep, I confronted her. But before she could answer, Jane spoke up, apologizing on her behalf, saying it was wrong that she had never tried to reconnect, but this was her way of making things right. She called it an olive branch. I didn't believe it, but looking at Jaden so happy to have them there, I told myself that maybe it was worth a try. For a few months things were almost normal. Jane visited often, and my mother came by on weekends, offering to help with Jaden while I worked. At first I appreciated it, but it didn't take long for her to start acting like she was in charge, rearranging my kitchen, criticizing how I ran my house, making it clear that she thought she knew better than me. I let it go at first, told myself it was just how she was, but eventually it became too much. I asked Jane to talk to her, hoping she could get through to her better than I could, but that only made things worse. The next day my mother called, furious that I had gone to Jane instead of speaking to her directly. She ranted about how I was being childish, how I should have just come to her like an adult. I put her on speaker and went back to work, ignoring her as she yelled through the phone. When she realized I wasn't listening, she hung up. That night, Jane called saying Mom was upset, that she had cried about the way I treated her. I told Jane I wasn't going to let her push me around like she did when I was a kid. I said I wanted space, that I didn't want my mother around for a while. Jane hesitated, tried to talk me out of it, but eventually she agreed. A few days later, I got a text from my mother apologizing for the phone call and saying she would keep her distance. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A year passed. Jane graduated college. Jaden turned 4. I found a reliable babysitter so I didn't have to rely on family, though Jane still helped occasionally. I saw my mother only at family events, where she kept her distance but still acted like everything was fine. I thought we had reached some kind of uneasy peace. I was wrong. I had no idea how bad things were going to get. I should have known better than to let my mother back in. When Jane first reached out, I thought it would just be her. She wanted to see me, to meet Jaden, and even though we had never been close, I figured there was no harm in letting her come by. I didn't expect to see my mother standing next to her when I opened the door. She smiled like nothing had ever happened between us, like we hadn't spent years avoiding each other, like she hadn't ignored my entire existence the moment Jane was born. I wanted to slam the door in her face, but Jaden, full of excitement at the idea of new people, ran past me and straight into Jane's arms. His happiness made me hesitate. I didn't want to drag him into whatever mess my mother was trying to bring into my life. So I stepped aside and let them in. At first, my mother was on her best behavior. She acted warm, affectionate, like she had been waiting for this moment all along. She asked Jaden questions about his toys, his favorite color, what he liked to eat. She smiled at him, ruffled his hair, played the role of the doting grandmother so naturally that it made my stomach turn. I hated how easily she pretended, how she could just slip into this part as if nothing had ever been wrong between us. When Jaden went to his room, I confronted her. I asked her why she was here, why she had never tried to reach out before now. I expected her to deflect, to make excuses, but before she could even answer, Jane stepped in, apologizing on Mom's behalf. She said it was wrong that Mom had never tried to reconnect, but this was her way of making things right. She told me I should give her a chance, that at the end of the day, they were my only family. I wanted to tell her that family isn't just blood. That being related to someone doesn't mean you owe them anything. But I looked at Jaden, saw how happy he was to have them there, and something inside me cracked. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, I could try. At first, it wasn't so bad. My mother started visiting more often, usually on weekends when I was working from home. She offered to help with Jaden, and for a while I thought it was a good thing. But it didn't take long for her true colors to show. She started rearranging my kitchen, claiming she was just trying to make it more efficient. She made comments about the way I dressed Jaden, the way I ran my house, the food I kept in my fridge. She acted like she was doing me a favor, like she was the one in charge. The worst part was that Jane acted like it wasn't a big deal. She told me it was just Mom's way of showing she cared, that she was trying to be involved. But I knew better. This wasn't love. This was control. One night, after a long day, I finally reached my breaking point. I asked Jane to talk to her, to tell her to back off before I lost my temper. Jane agreed, saying she'd handle it. The next day, my mother called me furious. She ranted about how I should have spoken to her directly instead of going through Jane. She accused me of being childish, of being ungrateful. I put her on speaker and let her talk while I continued working. When she realized I wasn't listening, she hung up. That evening, Jane called, saying Mom was upset. She told me that Mom had been crying, that she felt hurt by the way I treated her. I told Jane I wasn't going to let her walk all over me the way she did when I was a kid. I said I needed space, that I didn't want her around for a while. Jane tried to convince me to reconsider, but in the end, she agreed. A few days later, I got a text from my mother. She apologized for the phone call and said she would keep her distance. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. I knew this wasn't over. I knew she wasn't the type to just let things go. I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. I should have never trusted her. I knew better. But when Jane suggested that Mom babysit Jaden for a few hours while I was away for work, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, she could handle it. Jane had an interview that day, and my usual babysitter, Nancy, was unavailable. There weren't many options left. When I called Mom and asked, she was almost too eager to agree, like she was waiting for this opportunity. That should have been my first warning. Before I left, I sat her down and explained everything: Jaden's allergies, what he could and couldn't eat, the emergency contacts, where the EpiPen was, and what to do if anything happened. I even wrote it all down on a cheat sheet and left it on the fridge, just in case. She barely glanced at it before waving me off, saying, "You can trust me with your child. I raised you, didn't I?" Something about the way she said it put a knot in my stomach, but I ignored it. I had a 3-hour work meeting, and I couldn't afford to reschedule. I was barely halfway through my meeting when my phone rang. Jane. I ignored it at first, thinking she'd call back if it was urgent. Then she called again. And again. My stomach dropped. When I finally picked up, her voice was frantic. "You need to get to the hospital. Now." I don't even remember how I got there. My brain went blank, my body running on autopilot as I rushed through traffic, barely breathing until I reached the emergency room. When I saw Jaden lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, his face still swollen from an allergic reaction, my entire world cracked open. The doctor told me that Jaden had eaten cookies with gluten, one of his most dangerous allergens. Gluten? The very thing I had told my mother to avoid at all costs. My hands were shaking as I thanked the doctor, assuring them that this would never happen again. When I walked back into the waiting room, my mother was sitting there with Jane, her arms crossed like she was the victim in all this. I barely held it together as I asked what happened. She hesitated for only a moment before blaming Jaden, said he must have grabbed the cookie when she wasn't looking, that kids get into things, that it was an innocent mistake. But the moment she saw the look on my face, she changed her story. She admitted it. She had given him the cookies herself. I lost it. All the anger, all the pain, all the resentment I had bottled up for years finally spilled over. I yelled at her, demanding to know how she could be so careless. She tried to brush it off, saying she forgot, and that I was overreacting. That was it for me. I told her, loud and clear, that she would never, ever be left alone with my son again. She cried, of course. She tried to guilt me, saying I was being too harsh, that it was just one mistake. But this wasn't about her feelings. This was about my son's life. I told her to leave, and Jane followed after her, looking torn but saying nothing. Later that night, Jane texted me, asking me to reconsider. She said Mom felt awful, and that banning her from seeing Jaden without supervision was extreme. I told her that if she kept defending Mom, she'd face the same consequences. She backed down after that. I hired a full-time babysitter the next day. I wasn't taking any more chances. Mom was cut off from unsupervised visits, and Jane's role in Jaden's life became smaller too. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Things were only going to get worse. I had made my decision. My mother was never going to be alone with Jaden again. I thought Jane understood that, thought she had finally realized that there were no more chances left, but she proved me wrong in the worst way possible. A few months after the hospital incident, I had an urgent work situation on a Saturday, the same day as Jaden's monthly doctor's appointment. Nancy, my full-time babysitter, was at the hospital with her own child, so I called Jane, hoping she could step in just this once. She answered, said she had a work commitment, and then suggested that Mom could watch him. The second she said it, I was about to refuse, but before I could, I heard my mother's voice in the background, and she had no idea I was on the call. She started ranting, saying she wouldn't babysit Jaden even if she was being paid, that dealing with him and his condition was a burden, that I was the one who decided to have a child with so many issues, so I should be the one to deal with it. She kept going, calling me a bad mother for keeping this burden to myself, blaming me for the way Jaden was. Jane must have realized I could hear everything because she suddenly tried to stop Mom, but it was too late. I was done. I hung up on Jane and immediately called my mother. She picked up, her tone changing the second she realized it was me. She tried to apologize, tried to tell me that I misunderstood, that she was just frustrated because she had brunch plans with Jane, and she didn't mean what I heard. But I wasn't interested in her excuses. I told her she got exactly what she wanted. She wouldn't have to worry about Jaden being her burden anymore because she would never see him again. She started crying, begging me to reconsider, but I hung up before she could say another word. Jane didn't defend her this time, didn't try to argue, didn't even text me after. Maybe she finally understood that there was no fixing this. Maybe she was just too ashamed to face me. It didn't matter. I was done. That night, I took a rain check at work, rescheduled Jaden's doctor's appointment, and made a silent promise to myself, my mother would never have a place in our lives again. I had spent my entire childhood being unwanted by her, and I refused to let Jaden feel even a fraction of that. She had called him a burden, but the truth was, she was the only weight I had ever needed to drop. A year passed without my mother in our lives. Jaden still asked about her sometimes, but I always found a way to change the subject. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had made the right decision. I had built a life without her, one where Jaden was safe, where I didn't have to brace myself for whatever manipulation or guilt trip she had planned next. But of course, she wasn't going to let things end that easily. It started with gifts. At first, it was small things, a stuffed animal, a book, a card with a handwritten note about how much she missed her grandson. I ignored them, threw them away without saying a word. Then came the bigger gestures. For Jaden's 5th birthday, Jane showed up with an oversized gift bag full of expensive-looking boxes. I immediately knew they weren't from her. She confirmed it before I even asked, saying that the wrapped box inside was from her, but the rest were from Mom. I told her to take them back, but she refused, saying she didn't want to be in the middle of things and that I should at least consider the gesture. She said that at the very least, Jaden deserved to have a gift from his grandmother. I almost considered it. I almost let myself believe that maybe Mom was making an effort, that maybe this was her way of apologizing, even if she'd never say the words out loud. But then Jaden got excited and ripped open the first box, pulling out a stuffed animal. That seemed fine, harmless enough. But when he reached in for more, I froze. The rest of the bag was filled with cookies. Not just any cookies, but expensive bakery cookies made with ingredients Jaden was severely allergic to. My stomach twisted as I stared at them, realization crashing over me like a wave. She hadn't even bothered to check. After everything that had happened, after nearly killing my son once before, she still hadn't taken his allergies seriously. I quickly took the bag away, telling Jaden that the stuffed animal was the only thing inside. But he wasn't stupid. He saw the cookies, asked why he couldn't have one. I tried to explain, but he got upset, crying and insisting that Grandma had sent them for him, so they must be fine. It turned into a full-blown tantrum, and I was out of options. I called Mom, thinking that if she was the one to tell him, he would accept it. She answered immediately, like she had been waiting for my call. At first, she sounded smug, as if she expected me to thank her for her generous gift. But when I told her that she had sent something dangerous, that I needed her to tell Jaden that he couldn't eat them, she flipped. She went on a rant about how I was raising him wrong, how he wouldn't be so fragile if I wasn't forcing him into my hippie lifestyle, how I was depriving him of normal childhood experiences. She completely ignored the fact that his allergies weren't a choice. She refused to admit she had done anything wrong. I had no patience for her nonsense, so I cut her off and told her to just tell Jaden the cookies weren't for him. She sighed dramatically but finally did it, telling him over speakerphone that she had made a mistake and that they weren't for him. He calmed down after that, but I was boiling inside. After I hung up, I sat there, replaying her words in my head. The way she dismissed my choices as a mother. The way she still refused to take responsibility for putting Jaden in danger. The way she had never respected me, not when I was a child, not now. The next day she showed up at my door, holding another gift bag, acting like nothing had happened. I didn't let her in. I told her that since she wasn't happy with me, with my parenting, with the way I lived my life, then she didn't deserve to be a part of it. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying I was stealing her grandson from her, that she had spent years raising me only for me to treat her like this. When that didn't work, she tried to bring up the cost of the gifts, saying I was being petty for rejecting them. I went inside, grabbed the bag of presents she had sent, and shoved it back into her hands. Then, to make it clear that there were no strings left to pull, I wrote a check right there for the one gift Jaden had already opened. She called me petty. I called her a stranger. She left and I felt nothing. Jane called later, hysterical. Mom had gone home, thrown a tantrum, and made herself sick over it. She demanded that I apologize, that I fix things, but I refused. I told her that if Mom was really suffering, she'd be fine soon enough. Jane called me cold, unempathetic, and then hung up on me. I didn't care. My relationship with Jane had already suffered enough from this, and if she wanted to take Mom's side, then that was her choice. Of course, it didn't end there. A few days later, I started getting calls from extended family members. My paternal aunt was the first. She accused me of being a terrible daughter, of abandoning my mother when all she had ever done was raise me alone. She told me that Mom had been hospitalized and that I hadn't even bothered to visit. I wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of thing Mom would do. Play the victim, spread her version of the story to get sympathy from people who weren't there, who didn't know the full truth. I didn't explain myself. There was no point. I simply told my aunt that it was complicated and to stay out of it. When she wouldn't let it go, I hung up. Then I blocked her number. More calls came, but I ignored them. I had wasted enough years trying to prove myself to people who would never see my side. I had nothing left to give. A few days later, I packed a bag and took Jaden on a short vacation before he started kindergarten. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't check my phone for updates. I just needed a break, and for once I was going to put myself and my son first. If my mother wanted to destroy herself over this, that was her choice. But I wasn't going to be a part of it anymore. I hadn't seen or heard from my mother in months. After cutting her off, ignoring Jane's attempts to make me feel guilty, and blocking half my extended family, life had finally settled into something peaceful. Jaden was happy, I was focused on work, and for the first time in years, I wasn't constantly waiting for the next emotional disaster. But of course, peace was never something my mother was willing to let me have. The invitation came from an old childhood friend who was getting married in town. Normally, I wouldn't have bothered, but she had been my neighbor growing up, and she insisted that it would be good to see each other again. Jaden was excited about the idea of dressing up and going to a party, so I figured, why not? It was supposed to be a fun night out, something lighthearted, something normal. I should have known better. The moment I stepped into the reception hall, I saw Jane. My stomach twisted, but I wasn't going to cause a scene. I had been avoiding her since the last fight, and I figured if I kept my distance, we could get through the night without any problems. But then I saw who was sitting next to her, my mother. I felt Jaden squeeze my hand, and when I looked down at him, his face had lit up. Before I could stop him, he ran straight toward her, his little voice calling out, "Grandma, And for the first time in months, my mother had exactly what she wanted. Control. She looked up, all smiles and fake sweetness, and opened her arms for him. He hugged her like nothing had ever happened, like she wasn't the reason I had spent the last year trying to untangle my own childhood trauma. Jane looked over at me, hesitant, maybe even guilty, but she didn't say anything. I knew I had two choices. I could make a scene and pull Jaden away, confusing and upsetting him, or I could play along for now and keep my guard up. He had already seen her. If I tried to forcefully separate them, it would only make things harder later. So I took a deep breath and walked over. Mom didn't even look at me when she greeted Jaden. She acted as if I wasn't there, as if this wasn't the first time they had seen each other in months. When I sat down, she finally turned to me, her expression unreadable, and asked, "Can we talk?" I wanted to say no, wanted to remind her that she had lost the right to ask me for anything. But Jaden was right there, and I knew if I refused, he would ask why. I didn't want to have that conversation in the middle of a wedding. So I agreed. For the rest of the evening, she was on her best behavior. She sat with Jaden, listened to his stories, laughed when he showed her a trick he had learned at daycare. It made me sick to watch. Jane acted like everything was fine, like we were just another happy family catching up after some time apart. But I knew what this was. This was calculated. This was a performance. At the end of the night, as we were heading to the parking lot, Mom stopped me and asked, "So, did tonight go so badly?" I looked at her, trying to figure out where she was going with this, and then she said it, the thing I knew she had been waiting for all night. "Can I be part of his life again?" I exhaled slowly, already shaking my head before I even spoke. "No." Her face dropped. "After tonight? After seeing how happy he was? How can you say no?" I kept my voice calm, even though I wanted to scream. "Because you almost killed him, twice. Because you refused to take responsibility. Because you still think you did nothing wrong." She started crying, her voice louder now, drawing attention from the few remaining guests. She looked at Jaden, trying to make sure he was watching. "I just want to see my grandson. I love him. Why are you taking him away from me?" Jaden tensed, confused, his little hand tightening in mine. I could see the panic on his face, the way he didn't understand why Grandma was crying, why I wasn't letting her have what she wanted. Mom stepped closer, reaching for him. "I don't want to fight anymore, sweetheart," she whispered, looking at Jaden instead of me. "Come with Grandma. You can stay with me tonight. Wouldn't that be fun?" Jaden shrank back toward me. That was all I needed. I grabbed his arm and pulled him behind me, shielding him from her, my mother's face twisted in frustration. "You're making him scared," I said coldly. "This is why you won't see him again." She lost it. Right there in the middle of the parking lot, she started wailing, yelling that I was cruel, that I was selfish, that I was turning her own grandson against her. Jane tried to calm her down, but it was useless. People were staring now, whispering, probably wondering why this seemingly sweet older woman was crying about losing her grandchild. I didn't care. I picked up Jaden, turned my back on her, and walked away. He clung to me, shaking, his little fingers gripping my dress. My mother called after me, her voice breaking, begging me not to do this, but I didn't stop. That night, when I tucked Jaden into bed, he was quiet. I sat next to him, brushing his hair back, and finally he asked, "Why was Grandma sad?" I sighed, choosing my words carefully. "Because she wanted something she can't have." He thought about it for a moment before asking, "Will I see her again?" I shook my head. "Not for a long time, buddy." He didn't argue. I think, deep down, even he understood that something was wrong with her. The next day Jane called, her voice hushed like she was hiding from someone. "She's a mess," she whispered. "She cried all night. She keeps saying she just wants to see him." I didn't respond. I didn't care. Jane sighed. "What do we do now?" I hesitated, then finally said, "Nothing." There was nothing left to do. I didn't hear from my mother after that night. No texts, no calls, nothing. I should have felt relieved, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. She had spent her whole life making herself the center of every problem, and I knew she wouldn't just let go. Jane hadn't called either, which I took as a sign that things were bad on her end. I let it be. I wasn't going to chase after answers I didn't need. Then, about a month later, Jane finally reached out, her voice quieter than usual, like she was exhausted before she even started speaking. She told me she had taken Mom to see a doctor, that after everything, after the constant emotional outbursts, the manipulation, the unpredictable behavior, she had finally started to realize that something was really wrong. The doctor agreed. Mom was diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder. the psychiatrist had recommended that she be admitted to a private mental health facility, at least for a while, somewhere she could get proper care, proper treatment. Surprisingly, Mom agreed. Maybe she was too tired to fight, maybe even she had started to realize she needed help, or maybe she just thought it would be another way to make herself the victim. Either way, she was going. The facility was in another state, and Jane would be going with her for the admission process. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't shocked, not really. I had always known something was off about my mother, that her emotions weren't like other people's, that her reactions never made sense. The way she would go from cold and dismissive to overwhelming and possessive in an instant, the way she could convince herself she was the victim even when she was the one who had done the damage, it all made sense now. But understanding didn't mean forgiving. Jane must have sensed my hesitation because she quickly added that Mom would be covering the cost of her own treatment, that she wasn't asking me for anything. I hadn't even considered offering. Jane also passed along a message from Mom, saying that she would get better and see Jaden again when I allowed it. I didn't respond to that. It wasn't a promise I was going to make. For the first time, Jane didn't argue. She didn't try to convince me to be the bigger person, didn't try to guilt me into anything. Instead, she just said, "I get it now." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. A few days later, I got one last text from Jane before she left, saying she'd update me if I wanted, but she wouldn't push. I never replied. I wasn't ready to decide if I wanted to know how it all played out. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel trapped in my mother's orbit. I didn't feel like I owed her anything, didn't feel like I had to carry the weight of her emotions just because she gave birth to me. She was getting help, and that was her journey to deal with. Mine was different. Mine was making sure Jaden grew up in a home where he never had to question if he was loved, where he never had to fight for affection, where he never had to earn his place in his own family. I didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time I didn't care. It was mine to build on my own terms.